Welcome to Creepy and Geeky, a podcast about horror movies and other pop culture geeky stuff. I'm your host, Robert, and with me on this journey are my son, Harrison, and daughter, Katrina. Say hi to everyone.
Hello.
Hello.
They will be with me most episodes as we talk about lots of fun movies. All right, so first we wanted to have a little intro of sorts about how we got into making this podcast. My son, Harrison, and I, a few years ago, had decided to, I decided to do a podcast, and I roped Harrison into watching a bunch of Tarantino movies with me. We watched all of them, and then we did a few episodes discussing them, what we liked and what we didn't like. We put them up. I didn't get a really big audience for them, and so I just kind of got discouraged and I scrapped it. A few years went by, and I got really heavily into horror movies and started to talk to my daughter about horror movies because she was kind of dabbling in them as well. And we decided that we would do a podcast now with us discussing horror movies, talking about, we would watch a few movies like in a series or something, and then we would sit down, talk about them, because inevitably that's what we end up doing is we watch something and we have these big long discussions about it. Harrison and I will have 3-hour long discussions about Star Wars that will just continue on forever. And we do that with lots of other things. And we decided, hey, why don't we actually just make this into a podcast instead of just talking amongst ourselves? Maybe some people would get some entertainment value out of it. That's basically how it all came about. Originally, I was going to start it with just Katrina and I. Harrison kind of joined in and was going to be on some side episodes, but we all decided to do it all as one instead of doing separate podcast episodes with each other. That way we can all kind of combine everything and hopefully have some fun with it. So I mentioned that I got heavily into horror a few years ago. I've always enjoyed horror movies for the most part. I've been watching them since I was a kid. My parents didn't really restrict me on what I watched. So I grew up in the 1980s with the slasher era with Freddy and Jason, Michael Myers, Chucky, all the big ones. But I wasn't as they weren't a huge thing for me until recently. I've always been a comic book guy. I've always read comic books, and the rise in the comic book movies since the early 2000s has really been exciting for me, especially Marvel stuff, and the MCU specifically has really been exciting for me as a big Marvel fan all my life. And we'll be eventually doing some episodes on Marvel stuff as well. That's part of the geeky side of things. We're starting off with some horror for now. That being said, in the 90s, when the Scream movies came out, I got really heavily into those. I got excited about the new era of slashers. Scream is actually one of my favorite franchises now. And I again, dabbled in the horror genre, but with my wife and kids not being super into them, it made it a little bit more difficult to watch them when they were about. And so occasionally I would watch them. And like I said, it wasn't a huge thing for me. So it wasn't a big deal that I didn't watch them. But a few years ago, I was at a convention, ran across the booth for the t-shirt company Cavity Colors, and they were selling some Elvira pens, enamel pens. As anybody who knows me knows, I'm a huge Elvira fan. So I picked those up and peruse their t-shirts and stuff. And then after the con, I found them online and bought some stuff from them. Between them and discovering a podcast called Shockwaves, that really kind of deep dived me into giving horror more of a chance. I started buying up a whole bunch of movies and collectibles and t-shirts and everything, and it's become a huge part of my life now. Like everything in our house is horror, everything all over the walls, and it's literally all over the house. I'm sure it's annoying to everybody, but it's a fun genre that I've enjoyed getting to know and exploring. And now with both of you guys getting more into it, it's actually fun because I can kind of share the movies that I enjoy with you and see what you guys like. We don't always agree on some of the stuff that we do and don't like, but that's what's fun about it is the discussion and trying to see why we like things and why we don't like things. Katrina, how did you get into horror?
For me, I remember remember growing up, and I know you guys have told me this, and I like partially remember it, that I watched like the Bride of Chucky movie when I was like 4.
It was
And
actually
so I think,
Seed of Chucky when you were 3.
oh, okay, never mind. Sorry.
Yeah, we're good parents.
I mean, yes, but also, yeah. So that was like one of the first things. And then I remember just having the Scream movies play like in the background of just like doing homework or like coming to school, and one of the Scream movies would be on, or I would like go see my mom in her bedroom and Scream would be playing or something. I don't know. But I just remember those two being big parts of just like growing up, that specific portion of horror. But then when I was a little bit older, Harrison and my dad were watching Paranormal Activity. I think it was 2 or 3. And there was a scene where all the cabinets in the kitchen open. And I got so freaked out and scared by it. And I ended up having like, this is like completely irrelevant from the Paranormal Activity stuff, but I also had like quite a few nightmares around that time period. So then that kind of pushed me a little bit further away from horror, and anything that was horror related I just didn't want to interact with. But then a few years later, I ended up watching the first Saw movie and I think the second VHS movie on like Netflix or something. And that kind of pushed me back into considering horror movies. And then, like, I think maybe last year or something, I mentioned to dad that I was watching some movie. I don't know what movie it was, but
yeah, I don't remember what it was either.
yeah, but then we just started talking about it again, like talking about horror, and he mentioned the idea of making a podcast, and I was like, okay, sure. So that's my stuff with horror. I'm not like as big into it as my dad is, but I enjoy watching the movies and I enjoy talking about them. And if I could get more into the community, then I totally would, because I listen to like true crime podcasts and stuff. So that stuff is always really cool. And I always said that my genre of horror was more gore instead of all the paranormal stuff, because paranormal stuff still scares me to death because I believe in ghosts, but that's another thing for a later conversation. So I think that's where my history with horror and stuff comes from, is just, yeah.
All right. And you,
Sorry.
Harrison?
So I, just like my sister, grew up around Scream, playing inside the house. But the generation of horror that I grew up in was the Saw generation, the Grudge, the Ring, like the very kind of more supernatural, paranormal, or just straight up torture porn kind of horror, which at the time of growing up wasn't the kind of stuff that I was particularly wanting to watch, because stuff would give me nightmares. I remember seeing the trailer for The Grudge and that giving me nightmares without even seeing the movie. Beyond that, the things that really got me into horror at a young age were the Final Destination movies.
Those are always good.
Those movies, hands down, scared me to death, but in a good way. It was kind of a unique horror concept that kind of captivated me and kept me wanting to watch them over and over and over again. And then, so between Scream and Final Destination, that was kind of the movies I'd watch a lot when I was younger. And then when I got to college, I started to kind of open up a little bit more into other movies. I started looking more at the classics, really found my niche in movies like Alien and The Thing, which really kind of encapsulated everything I kind of appreciate in horror, which is that body horror mix of gore, as well as nigh impossible to defeat antagonists, as well as just an overwhelming sense of dread and essence of almost determined fate, which I think comes a lot from my appreciation of the Final Destination movies when I was watching them. And I feel a lot of that in the Alien movies and The Thing as well. Since then, I've dabbled in a couple other different horror movies, watched the Paranormal Activities when I was younger. Those were good. And in adulthood, watched some of the more kind of artistic horrors, as well as just kind of the kind of uncomfortable kind of horrors. So I like examples of those would be Hereditary, Midsummer, and Lighthouse. All of those are great. Get Out, that's another great one. So I think that we're kind of in somewhat of a horror renaissance that I've kind of gotten into as well.
Oh yeah, I totally believe we're in a horror renaissance.
Mm.
And it's not just any one type either. It's like It's multiple genres of horror that are just like everything is just like it's not all good, but like I like that everybody's trying to do something different now.
Yeah, I think we've gotten to the point where even recent movies like Halloween Kills and the most recent Halloween, they take a classic character but try to do something new with them that make them more interesting, kind of flip their motives a little bit, kind of give them a little bit of a different kind of perspective and effect on the characters around them beyond just being a guy with a knife. And I think that that's really interesting and cool. Otherwise, obviously we're recording this in October, so I've been watching a lot of the classics, kind of catching up on a lot of ones that I missed. So watched Friday the 13th as well as part 2. I'm watching a couple other newer horror movies, ones that are a little bit more goofy and weird, like Happy Death Day. Those ones are fun. But yeah, so that's kind of where I sit on horror.
Well, definitely, I think we all come from different perspectives. I mean, especially just different ages and different upbringings and whatnot, different time periods. We all have our different things. Harrison says he likes the body horror and the weird stuff. I'm more of a horror comedy type of person. I like the Evil Dead series. That's my favorite franchise of horror. I like, Tucker and Dale versus Evil. That kind of just fun, doesn't take itself too seriously. I think that's why I like the Scream series too much, because it really, it balances some real horror, real slasher stuff, but also balances that meta, breakdown of horror and kind of comedy and stuff in a way that, a lot of horror movies do try to do, but not all of them succeed. That's usually the stuff I gravitate more towards, or the stuff that I tend to find to be my favorites, is the horror comedy side of stuff. And Katrina, what did you say your favorite genre of horror is? If you did,
I don't have like a specific genre that I'm more fond of, but
okay.
I will say that like I don't enjoy the paranormal stuff as much, just because I mean, I guess I do because it just freaks me out so much. But I think for me, I think I enjoy movies like The Purge and Midsummer. I'm trying to think
Midsummer
of
is
more
definitely
examples.
a personal favorite of mine.
But yeah, I'm trying to think of more examples of that kind of stuff. I do really like the Halloween series. I've watched the first 3 movies, 2018, and the newest one, the Halloween Kills, and I've enjoyed all of them. So
personally, I know this will probably get people on my back, but personally, I think those are, at least the better ones of the series. Whereas, all the middle stuff is kind of iffy at best for me anyway. But
yeah, I don't know the genres enough to say I have a specific one that I like, but those are definitely examples of what I like, I guess.
Okay.
Oh, and The Quiet Place. That's also a really good one.
That's a good one. Well, this podcast isn't going to be solely about horror movies. It'll probably be predominantly about horror movies, but we would like to delve into some of the geeky stuff on occasion as well. Harrison and I had talked previously about doing episodes on Marvel movies and their ties to comic book storylines. I grew up with Marvel comic books, and I a lot of the MCU stuff is cherry picking bits and pieces from storylines. They don't mimic the storylines directly, which is actually a really good thing. As much as I love those stories, I don't need to see them live action beat for beat. I like seeing how they're going to take a concept and twist it and change it. That's the kind of stuff that Harrison and I tend to get into the nitty gritty of that when we talk about it. And Katrina has expressed interest in joining us for those conversations here on the podcast. So we're going to all do that. So we'll talk about some comic book movies. We'll be talking some Star Wars. Katrina and I really love the cartoon Steven Universe. So we might have a little Steven Universe episode eventually.
I'm also trying to get my dad into She-Ra. Harrison and I have already watched She-Ra, but my dad hasn't yet. So I'm really, really trying to get him to watch it. And if anyone who's listening to the podcast like She-Ra, try to force my dad into it. Do it.
Yeah,
DM and flood his DMs into requests for She-Ra.
I will watch it. I do. It's on my list. It's just I have a forever list of stuff that I'm trying to get to. So, but I will watch it. Katrina didn't steer me wrong with Steven Universe, and
She-Ra should be at the top of your list.
It should be. It literally should be.
It's fantastic.
All right. Well, Harrison got to see a little bit of Steven Universe recently. He didn't watch the whole series, but he caught some episodes here and there while his wife was watching it. We're gonna try to get some more of that. Maybe Harrison can finish up, watch through it again. It's not super long, so you might be able to barrel through and get some more of those episodes watched. But yeah, we'll talk about that. We'll eventually talk about She-Ra. I will watch it. And then we'll talk about other fun stuff, other cartoons, other movies, other things that we might be into, games, whatever we decide. But I think by and large, it's going to be about horror movies and the horror genre, because that was the initial idea behind it. I want to eventually bring guests into it. That may or may not be with Katrina and Harrison. That just depends on scheduling. They both work all the time, and Katrina goes to school, so it's a little bit harder to schedule stuff like that. As it is, we've been trying to schedule this first episode forever, and it's taken a while. I mean, we moved and had a whole bunch of stuff get in the way, but we're finally getting there. But yeah, I'd like to eventually get some other people on to discuss other movies and other things, and that may just be with me and the guest, but we'll see what happens. So, but our usual format for the episodes will be, I'd like for the beginning of the episode to be talking about some horror or geek stuff that we've watched or read or experienced between episodes. We're hoping to get these out regularly, but schedules could get in the way. But if we can get this going pretty regularly, that's what I want to do, is discuss what we saw in the last week. We can maybe do a little tease for a future episode where we discuss them more in detail, if it's something that seems like something we'd want to deep dive into. I know Katrina and I had discussed doing episodes on the Halloween franchise, the Friday the 13th franchise, and other stuff. We're going to try to do stuff where it's like 2 or 3 different movies, or 2 or 3 movies in a series, or by the same director or something like that, so that we have sort of a theme going on every episode. And that's going to be the bulk of the episode, is we're going to be talking about those 2 or 3 movies, what we liked, what we didn't like, that kind of thing. That leads into our next segment, which is we are going to be talking about the original Evil Dead trilogy and the remake. We did not get to the Ash vs. Evil Dead series in time before this, but we can discuss that in a later episode. But for now, we're gonna barrel right into Evil Dead 1. I've been a huge fan of the Evil Dead series for a long time. I actually was introduced to it through Army of Darkness back in 1993 when it came out to the theater. I actually saw it in the theater and fell in love with it. The goofiness of it just spoke right to me, and I enjoyed it, and it's got so many quotable lines and everything else. And then later on, I went back and watched the other Evil Dead movies that came before it and loved those just as much. And I've been a huge fan ever since. The kids, they knew about it, but I don't think either one of them really watched them too much before recently. You guys can correct me if that's wrong, but
No.
I caught bits and pieces whenever you watched it, but I never watched in totality.
Right.
Yeah, I knew about it, and I'd only ever seen the characters when you started watching the show.
Okay. Yeah. And so recently, for the 40th anniversary, the first Evil Dead was back in theaters. And since both of my kids work in theaters, I was able to go see it with my daughter. And we went and saw it on the big screen, both of us for the first time on the big screen. And for Katrina, the first time ever, which was a fun experience. The movie was good. The movie was great. We had the theater had some technical difficulties, which was hilarious.
I was out getting popcorn, so I didn't really see a lot of it, but
well, the movie was supposed to start at 7:00, and we sat there, and right at 7:00, when I got into the theater, it switched from the pre-show commercial ad stuff that they play. And we sat there, and they switched from that to a Chevy ad, I guess you would say. It was just a still image.
Yeah, it was a static Chevy ad on the screen.
Yeah. And they were playing country music, and we were like, okay, this is weird. Why aren't they just playing trailers or something else? And we just kind of went, okay, maybe they don't play trailers in front of a special screening of a movie. And so we sat there, and about 5 minutes in, Katrina said, hey, Dad, why don't I go over and find out what's going on? And I was like, no, I'm sure it'll be fine. 20 minutes in, Katrina's like, I'm going to go get some popcorn. And so she leaves, and just as she gets back, the movie pops on. But it's like 2-3 minutes in and there's no sound. You're still hearing the country music playing. There's no movie sound. We're like, everybody in the theaters like getting raucous and rowdy, and they're like, what's going on? And Katrina came back right when that was happening. She's like, what's going on? So then the funny thing was, whoever was in the projection booth stopped it. And when they stopped it, it went out to a Dish Network menu. So it was an interesting, like, Dish DVR type special thing. But they had to restart it from there. They restarted it and then had to fast forward through all the stuff that we would have been watching for 20 minutes and then stopped it in time for the Bruce Campbell intro that was supposed to be for this special 40th anniversary screening. Once that happened, everybody was chill, everybody was calm, and the movie played fine throughout the whole rest of the time. And we had a good time. I enjoyed seeing it on the big screen for the first time. Katrina, how did you like it?
It was definitely interesting. It was funny. It kind of spooked me a few times. And then there were just definitely some very absurd moments that I was like, why is this in the movie? But then I realized that it's a really old movie with a really low budget, and that's just how some things are. So I just kind of went past it and was like, okay, this is just how it is. And everyone else in the audience was also reacting sort of similarly to me. I'm sure most people in the audience had already seen it, but yeah, it was definitely an interesting experience, and I don't regret seeing it in the theater at all. So
yeah, no, I mean, all the technical issues aside, it was a good showing, and I enjoyed it quite a lot, seeing it, and with a crowd and hearing everybody laughing at some of the same spots and everything. So it was a good time. Harrison, when was the first time you got to see the first Evil Dead?
Probably in full. I want to say I probably watched it with you when I was a little bit younger, but the most recent time that I remember exactly is when I was in undergraduate college, when I was with my wife and I was showing them to her because I was aware of them because of you, and I figured it was something to watch. And we watched both Evil Dead 1 and Evil Dead 2 at that point. And then very recently I rewatched them again for the podcast. But that was the most recent time that I can remember that I could say that I first watched it.
And did you enjoy them right off the bat?
Yeah, I think more than anything, I think that Bruce Campbell, especially growing up with you, because Bruce Campbell was always a figure around us when we were growing up because of your appreciation of Evil Dead. Just seeing him be Bruce Campbell on screen was more of a joy than anything else.
And I know you don't remember this probably, Harrison, but you were actually with me when I met Bruce Campbell during the book tour for his second book. I got that book signed and my copy of the Book of the Dead edition of the DVD, which I actually still have sitting over on my shelf. But yeah, you were there with me. If I'm remembering correctly, he said hello to you as well.
I vaguely remember.
Yeah.
Something happening.
Yeah. And we got it. We had a picture. I don't know.
Yeah, I think I remember having a picture at some point.
Yeah, it was a picture on the side, from the side and everything. And so I don't know where that picture is anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Later on, I got another picture with him at a convention, so I was happy to at least get that. So you saw Evil Dead 2 also at that time, and then yes. And Katrina, you only watched it recently when we were talking about doing these for the first podcast episode. So what did you guys both think of the second Evil Dead compared to the first Evil Dead? Whichever one wants to go first.
You can go first, Katrina.
Okay, so I enjoyed the second movie. I always knew that he had like a chainsaw for a hand, so I was like wondering when that was gonna show up in the movies. So that was definitely, I was glad that it was in the second movie and I didn't have to wait too long in the series to understand why that was going on. One thing I did think that was a little absurd and was like, why is this in the movie, was the whole like stop motion bit with his girlfriend like coming out of the grave and just like her dancing and like riding a tree. It was like very absurd. It was funny though, but it was a good movie. So I definitely think that its little like kind of sped up version of the first movie, I didn't like it as much. I like the first movie better than like the sped up version that they put into the second one. So
All right. I think that with Evil Dead 2, they took what they learned from Evil Dead 1 and took what worked and amplified it, and then what didn't work, they cut it out and either shortened it or kept it in but made it better. And I think that Evil Dead 2 is equal parts a great reboot and a good sequel. And I think that they did a really good job on kind of expanding upon the world that was created with Evil Dead 1. And I think that both movies are very tight movies with very bare bones plot, but in a good way where each of them doesn't provide any unnecessary exposition to get the characters to where they need the characters to be by a certain point. And I think that's a strength. And I think the characters that are introduced in Evil Dead 2 are fantastic and unique and wild in their own way.
All right. Like I said before that I came into it from Army of Darkness and then went into it coming into 1 and 2. Army of Darkness has always been my favorite one, the one that because I think just because it was the one I saw first. That it's the one I appreciate the most. And like I said, I think the most iconic lines come from Army of Darkness. But Evil Dead 2, I think, does a really good job at recapping the stuff that happened in the first movie and forging ahead with the new story and getting to the point where leading into Army of Darkness. It definitely feels like a middle chapter of a trilogy in a way, not just a sequel, but definitely going with a plan into doing something bigger. So it's a lot of fun. I definitely put it up there. I still think Army of Darkness is my favorite more than Evil Dead 2, but I think in a lot of ways Evil Dead 2 is probably the better movie just because it's not as crazy and wild as Army of Darkness is. It's still more it's horror comedy, but it still airs more on the side of horror, whereas Army of Darkness is kind of a weird or like an action horror comedy, heavy on the action and comedy, with little sprinklings of horror here and there. But I definitely think that for me, Army of Darkness will always be my favorite. What do you guys think of Army of Darkness after having seen that one as well, Harrison?
I thoroughly enjoy Army of Darkness. I think that Army of Darkness is probably my favorite of the trilogy as well. I think that it has the most fun with the world that was created by Sam Raimi, and it has a lot of great moments and quotes, like you were saying, where I think that in terms of the three, it's the most iconic in my mind, because when I think of Evil Dead, the scenes that I think of more than any of them typically come from Army of Darkness. And there's still things from the earlier Evil Deads that I think of, like the Deadite in the basement and the hatch, as like key visuals. But really, it's the like Evil Ash and the Tiny Ashes, Klaatu Barada Necktie. It's those kind of things that stand out in my mind more than anything whenever I think of Evil Dead, that I think makes Army of Darkness stand out for me.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. Like that's definitely it's for me. It's those things that make it the standout. What about you, Katrina?
I think that Army of Darkness is probably the best film of the three, just because of its production value and I think its entertainment value as well. I think that I enjoyed watching Army of Darkness probably the most just because of its absurdity, but it's also a mix of drama and action. So I think that overall it's probably one of the most balanced of the three.
Right.
And has the better storyline.
Yeah. No, I agree. Obviously, I mean, you're preaching to the choir here.
Mm-hmm.
And then, they take a break and they don't do any Evil Dead movies for a long time. And then we finally get the remake by Fede Alvarez, much darker in tone, more in line with the first movie in a lot of ways. The first movie I don't think was meant to be as funny. I think the humor that comes from that is largely not completely unintentional, because I do think they meant to have some lighter tones to it here and there. But I think the things that we typically laughed at were the unintended things, like the one girl. I can't remember. I don't think it was the sister. I think it was the girlfriend of Scotty. I think when she was dying, when one of them was dying, it was like overly long. Mm-hmm. While she was just yelling and screaming, and it was so when
it was
we
like
watched,
uncomfortable.
It was uncomfortable. We watched it in the theater this last time. Everybody around us was like quietly, nervously chuckling because it was going on so long, and we were just so like, okay, when is this going to stop? And so that, I think, the comedy was more unintentional in that than they meant it to be. But where the remake comes in, you don't get a lot of comedy. I don't think there's really any moments in that movie where you get any kind of laugh. There's no real lightheartedness to it. So it's definitely coming at a different angle, which was not a bad choice at all. Surprisingly, for quote unquote remake, that it definitely did not feel like, they were hitting a lot of the same beats as the first movie did without being a carbon copy. And I appreciated that a lot. And they really amped up the gore and the terror. It was uncomfortable to watch. I remember Harrison and I actually went and watched this at the theater when it first came out. And he and I were cringing a lot at some of the more gruesome parts because it's brutal. And the first movie bills itself as an experiencing grueling terror, and it doesn't even compare to this now. For 1981, that was probably really horrible and gross and gruesome and everything, but 40 years on, it's pretty tame in comparison to what came after it. And especially the remake was just crazy amounts of gore, and it upped the level of what an Evil Dead movie was without either forgetting where it came from or, like I said, being a carbon copy. It forged its own path and did so in such a great way that it's definitely one of the better remakes of any movie ever. It's one that I like to go back to and watch whenever I'm in the mood for that kind of movie.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel about it. I think that it was referential but unique in its own way. One of my favorite things that they did with it was the annotated Necronomicon. I like the idea that this book has been passed down through history, and all of these people who are wanting to do good have put notes into this evil book about saying, don't read this passage, or like, do this to stop the Deadites. And just these ill-fated individuals who have come across this book over the thousands of years that it's been passed down. I think that for the reboot, I think the other things that kind of stood out to me was that I was really happy to see the return of the melting Deadite corpse. It's something that only happens towards the end of the movie, but the final Deadite actually melts into a very similar pile of goo that the Deadites from the first movie turn into.
Right.
Not quite as long and drawn out. Yeah. But it was really cool to see them kind of mimic that dissolving evil that was in the first movie. And then the other thing that was, I think the only thing that really was sort of a disappointment for me with the remake was kind of how simple the Deadite expression was within people. That it was just kind of like a change in their eyes, and they just looked a little evil in the face. I really appreciated in Evil Dead 1 and 2, where when someone was possessed by the Deadites, it was just a complete body transformation. Like they were a monster. And then that's why when they would shift back into their more normal looking and unassuming visages to kind of trick some of the characters into doing things for them or just trying to mess with them, it was much more of a dramatic transition than it was inside of the remake, because the remake, it was kind of just like, okay, well, now their eyes are normal. And so I think that I think that was the one thing that I kind of wish was a little bit different and a little bit more like the originals when it came to the remake. Otherwise, it's a fantastic movie, and I think that it stands on its own as a great addition to the series.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say for certain that the reason why they did that, but I think maybe just because they were doing a more modern update of it, they wanted to do more of a, I guess, more of a body corruption, like a sickness, which is what it kind of felt like to me. The Deadite possession was more of a corruption of the body and soul and whatever, and so it just made your body just gross and weird and everything, rather than like that possession like they did in the first in the first trilogy and stuff. They go back to that. They actually go back to that. I know we haven't watched it, but you guys haven't watched it. But in Ash versus Evil Dead, the series, they go back to the traditional Deadite look. So you get that a lot more in that series.
Well, yeah, because I think Deadites in general are one of the most unique movie villains that have been generated for horror. They have very similar elements to zombies and vampires and other kind of manipulatory undead, while at the same time being these very nasty, like potty mouth demons that just look to try and get a rise out of someone. And oftentimes they'll look like someone, like they'll take the visage of the person you love just to make you feel bad about something, and then cut you down and insult you, and in a way that isn't very self-preservationist. They just are looking to kind of almost prey on your love and your emotions for the people that they've inhabited, and that makes them, in my opinion, very like uniquely evil among the horror villains that you can witness in cinema.
Yeah, it's definitely more of a pure evil in that way. There's nothing good about a Deadite.
No.
There's never been any of them that were any kind of good. They're just straight up evil, manipulating you and doing what they want to do to try and kill you. And if they can't kill you, they're gonna fuck you up mentally and take you down with them, basically, in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So, Katrina, what'd you think of the remake?
It was definitely more gory. Definitely made me feel more uncomfortable than just like someone taking forever to die, like in the first one. Right. Made me squirm a little bit just because of everything. But I think for me, I liked how they portrayed the Deadites more, because I feel like the way that I interpreted the Deadites for the reboot, like the 2013 one, it felt like each person was possessed by a different entity. But in the first few ones, it seemed like it was the same entity possessing different bodies. Like,
yeah, I could see that.
And for me, it just, and also for the reboot, I liked that it wasn't just them attacking other people with like their own hands or whatever. They like went out of their way to find weapons and find more creative ways to hurt other people and themselves.
Right.
And I don't know, I really like the 2013 one because of how different it is.
Yeah. And
I like the homages to everything from the first three.
Yeah.
Because I think that's what makes a good reboot, is that it doesn't just distance itself from the first one and like completely reboot everything. It connects itself to the original series in a way. Because that's really what the 2013 one is it's a connection to the first ones, because it's like they came back to the same cabin. It's not the same cabin and nothing happened previously. It's the same cabin that Ash went in.
Right. Yeah. So, and they actually, and I actually read something about that. And the director said that that's what it is. It's the book, and the Deadites were basically drawing people back in. It's drawing people back to the cabin, and it's just a cycle rather than something completely new. And I think that like any good remake will have, or reboot, because I mean, ultimately this was meant to be more of a reboot of the franchise. They talked about doing a sequel to this one that never got off the ground, and then they ended up doing Ash versus Evil Dead instead. But a good remake slash reboot will continue the storyline in a way and not totally ignore what happened before. And I think, but also, forge its own path. And that's what you want, I think. In a lot of ways. And I think that there's some movie franchises that have started to figure that out, that doing a full-on reboot of something typically doesn't work. Nobody tends to care about, a full-on reintroduction to everything, and trying to do something new instead of trying to make it connect to the original and make it more fun and just introduce new concepts that can continue on rather than pushing all the old stuff aside. I mean, it doesn't always work. Go ahead.
Sorry. I think a good example where you're talking about where it's not like an entirely separate faction of the series is the Halloween series, because it doesn't ignore the first few movies. I mean, it does in a way, but it connects it back to that, and it doesn't ignore, I don't know.
No, I get what you're saying. The Halloween movies are kind of a mixed bag because they've tried rebooting, reconnecting several times, and they've done this multiple times already. But I do agree with you that the more recent movies by David Gordon Green are, because they're wiping away all that history of the sequels, but at the same time they're honoring that by putting in little Easter eggs like the Halloween 3 masks and the little line about how Laurie was his sister, but that was just a rumor, it wasn't true. That kind of stuff that ties to the originals without throwing it completely away, that can make it fun and reverent in a way without completely going off the rails and going on to new stuff. But it also just takes, good filmmakers who can just make something fun and interesting that doesn't shit on what was there in the past. I mean, you look at the Scream franchise. The Scream franchise now is about to come out with its 5th movie, and it's a continuation of the series. They didn't have to do that. They could have rebooted it. They did it with a TV series, which, had some minor success and everything, but definitely wasn't successful compared to the movie franchise. And so, they're continuing along that sequel line, which is great. I think that Scream holds it together better than most do in terms of continuity and quality of their movies. And I'm really excited to see the new one. But if you can't do the sequels, if you can't do sequels and an actual continuation, then doing something that's part of that, like let's say Ghostbusters, there's the new Ghostbusters Afterlife, which is going to be more of a continuation of the first 2 movies, whereas the 3rd movie was more of a reboot of the entire franchise, kind of ignoring everything that happened and actually having the original actors in different roles, which just seemed weird and out of place. It's not necessarily a bad movie. I know it gets a lot of shit for it, but I think that I think that just people were expecting something different from it. And by and large, that's why a lot of people didn't like it. There's a lot of varying degrees of who didn't like it. There's a lot of hate on it being an all-female cast, which I didn't care. I like that. But, just not having it connect to the original series in a way just felt, I guess, hollow. And I'm hoping that Ghostbusters Afterlife, being that it's connecting to the original series, will kind of reorient that back, and there'll be some fun and continue on with new characters, because that's that's what you want from a franchise, is to continue to be make new movies. You want to introduce new characters and keep going. Some do it well, some don't do it well, and Harrison and I have had plenty of discussions about the Star Wars sequels, and I'm sure we'll get into that in another episode.
I'm sure.
But I mean, I think that's going back to Evil Dead, I think that's what they did well. They introduced you to a new group of characters in a similar situation, facing similar problems, and gave us a new hero in Mia. And I hope someday we actually get to see more of her story.
Mm-hmm.
It'd be really cool. There is a new Evil Dead movie coming out next year, I believe, on HBO Max. I believe it's early early next year. So we'll be getting it. It's called Evil Dead Rise. A whole new cast of characters. Ash is not a part of it. Bruce Campbell has said that he is done playing Ash, but he is involved as a producer. They've got a new writer director on it, but Sam Raimi, Bruce Campbell, and Rob Tappert, who have been part of the Evil Dead franchise from the beginning, are still part of it, still spearheading it, guiding it. And this one's going to be set in an apartment building in a city. So this should be taking it out of the woods, taking it out of the putting it someplace different. It's going to be very interesting. So,
yeah.
Be lots of fun to see what they do with it. You guys have anything else about Evil Dead?
The only other things that I had in my notes here was that for Evil Dead 2, a lot of that movie felt like they gave Bruce Campbell very bare bones instructions. Okay, the head is on your hand and you have to get from the cabin to the tool shed. And it's up to you on how you get there. And they just said, all right, and action. Because it feels like that entire scene where he is running out of the cabin and getting to the tool shed and just banging that head across everything in his path. It just feels like there was no spots on the ground for him to get from point A to point B. It definitely felt like let's just let Bruce be Bruce and see what he does.
I think some of it was definitely, I think, improvisational. But I know that Bruce has remarked on more than one occasion that working with Sam Raimi, that Sam likes to torture him. And so he will specifically do stuff that will be like that, just, run around, do this, and so, bring your hand onto a tree, and so it'll be more about just like whatever torture that Sam can come up with to torment Bruce with.
That's great.
Yeah.
Definitely felt that when you got hit in the face with the branch on the drive back to the cabin.
That specifically was definitely a Sam Raimi hitting him in the face thing. That was very gleeful from what I've heard, from Bruce Campbell's point of view anyway.
Yeah.
So
but yeah, and then I think the only other thing I had was just as much as it did take a long time, I want to give credit where it's due, at least in my mind, in that in the first Evil Dead, when it in the ending, the stop motion effects where I don't know what they were using, like grits or oatmeal or whatever was coming out of the sleeves. That sequence, that stop motion sequence of the deadites dissolving, while long, is incredibly visually horrifying to actually consider, if from the perspective of Ash, that his friends are becoming this horrid goop in front of him. And it is a quite horrifying and distinct image in my mind to consider from Ash's perspective.
Yeah. I mean, he literally watches his entire group of friends and his girlfriend and his sister all die to this. It's definitely something that would make you go a little nuts for sure.
Oh yeah, and we see that in Evil Dead too.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I think that's all I got.
All right. Katrina, any last thoughts about Evil Dead?
Not really.
All right. But you guys enjoyed the series as a whole, and
oh yeah, it's a fantastic series of horror films. I think that it's kind of a must watch for anyone who's a fan of the genre. It just has affected so much after it that it is almost required viewing.
Yeah, no, I agree. I like, it's, besides being a personal favorite of mine, I do think that there's a lot that people can get out of it, and just even if it's just enjoyment. I think that you just enjoy the series as a whole, and just see the progression of them getting better as filmmakers and actors, and just the progression of the mythology. And by the time you get to Ash versus Evil Dead, they know where they're going with it a little bit better. They will definitely have to get you guys watching it. I need to rewatch it myself, refamiliarize myself with it. But we should definitely do another episode on Ash versus Evil Dead. See what you guys think about that. The continuing adventures of Ash in his older years.
Speaking of, I think something that we didn't really touch on, but I think is also important to state, is that Ash is one of the most iconic horror protagonists in the genre. From just a design perspective of the man with the boomstick and the chainsaw hand, and from a kind of just a prolific status on having some very iconic lines and being just a touchstone of pop culture in general. I think that you'd be hard pressed not to find someone who hasn't heard Hail to the King, especially considering its continued distribution through games like Duke Nukem, and other games that are very referential to these very classic horror and action movies. And so I think that as a piece of popular culture, Ash is an incredibly significant figure.
Oh yeah, I would definitely say he's a pop culture and a horror icon, and just based on 3 movies, compared to his horror peers who have even more movies under their belt. And not saying that they didn't become icons in their own from their first movies or whatever, but for only having 3 movies that and eventually a TV series, but just from those 3 movies alone, he was an icon. And we have the trope of the final girl in a lot of the horror movies of the 80s and later, but Ash is a final boy. It flips the script on that trope, and not necessarily that it had to be a trope. I don't think by 1981, by the time it was released, and it was filmed in 1979, so it was only a year after Halloween had come out. And so they're probably at that point, I don't think there was the final girl trope was so prolific, but it was interesting to see it in the context of that compared to what you typically got, especially as the 80s went on. So, but yeah, I mean, I agree, full on icon. And like I said, it's my favorite horror franchise by far. So.
I think it's one of the most consistently good horror franchises, in that you can watch all 3 of the trilogy and the remake and always have a good time.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Which is something that a lot of horror franchises can't necessarily say.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, the quality in a lot of horror franchises, ebbs and flows depending on who the directors are and the writers and such. And being that Sam Raimi was the consistent guiding hand, and Bruce Campbell was in each one of them, you definitely get a consistency that a lot of the other horror movies didn't have at the time. If anybody listening hasn't watched the Evil Dead series, or you've only watched bits and pieces here and there, I definitely recommend that you give it a shot. It's fun, it's exciting, it's gooey, lots of grossness, but it's definitely a fun time. You all should give it a try for sure. All right. I think that about wraps up the discussion for the Evil Dead and this first episode of our podcast. I hope you all enjoyed listening to us. I think we all had a fun time talking about Evil Dead and everything else. So we will wrap it up here. You can find us online. The podcast is available through most podcasting apps. I know it's available on Spotify, Pocket Casts, and Apple Podcasts. You should be able to find it pretty much anywhere. Just search out Creepy and Geeky podcast. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at Creepy and Geeky. And you can find me at Twitter and Instagram under the name Geek Thulhu. That's GeekThulhu. A lot of people misspell that and don't add that extra H at the end. But yeah, you can follow me there. You can follow the podcast at Creepy and Geeky. I know Harrison doesn't have any social media, so you can't really follow him anywhere. Katrina, would you like people to follow you anywhere?
Sure. Yeah. So you can follow me on Instagram at ROCKMNKY and on Twitter at RCKMNKY.
Well, I think that about wraps us up for this time. And we will see you in the next episode. We don't have a plan on what the next episode is going to be about. We're kind of juggling a few things around. Maybe I'll put a poll online and see what you guys think about what we should talk about next time. Stay creepy, everybody.